Pretty much. Oh, that's a little bit. She's teaching class for the kids. I was like, you want me to teach about the money? Who am I teaching?
Yeah, last summer she made had some visitors and she made them to offer. She said, you know, if y'all come for class, I'll teach the kids. And then the next weekend is she's out of town. Okay.
Yeah. All hands on deck, whoever's there.
So we had to try class. You learn fun? You good at class? Square footage.
Sorry?
Less square footage.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've met you.
And Paul, man,
Nice to meet you, Michael.
You met Laura?
Briefly. Oh, wait. What is that there?
I guess she doesn't think she's been here since I've been here. You have, but
Yeah.
I don't think I have. It's been a little while.
that's right. The unfortunate incident. Let's try not to talk about. Yeah. Glad y'all here. I wasn't sure if I would fill an entire class with people in Paramount, but now that we got a whole group of people here, they made one preacher. They made one preacher. By the way, I was like, we need to let Andrew preach now. He wants a day off.
More fun for me than
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. I never think about that. It's right.
yeah, that's funny.
You got extra running. That is shit. Oh, I can.
Did you do what Lazarus? Oh yeah, yeah, I'm gonna show up. Oh, well, it's right. Yeah.
What did y'all? What did y'all do?
We got down yesterday.
Okay.
Everybody did.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're here.
Yeah, I think it's a bit late. 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't use this stuff. Sure. Some of mine is not.
All the time, never said it. You have to go to sleep in my house. What you go to the house? You go to the house. The last 2 months.
Yes. Yeah. Long. Good health. The city or just stick.
I'm fine. So nice. You can talk about some more than one thing.
Hey, I'm listening to you.
Guys, sorry. You know it's true.
The hat's going to say good. Never say
Well, I think we are ready to get started. Yeah, if you want to turn to Luke 16. I hope that I had this streaming set up and I forgot to mute the microphone, even though I had the slide blocked off. So hopefully they couldn't hear all the people talking, but we'll see how that goes. But that's fine. Um, all all one or two people. Can we? I'm sorry, we do need to get started, please. I know, but I gotta. We're already 3 minutes over. We're gonna start in Luke 16. Actually, what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with a little review since we've got a lot of people that I know that have not been here. And I think it's important when we look at what we've been talking about to take it in a bigger context. What we've been trying to do when we talk about each of the parables is to take them in the context of the text that they're being written in. And this context goes all the way back, if you remember, into Luke 14, where it gives even past this initial discussion, where Jesus is at the feast of the Pharisees. The Pharisees invited him to eat with him, and as a result of that, he's making these observations about their attitudes about their places at the feast, their place of honor, and what was considered important to them. And he describes the attitude of the ones who are talking about how what a great honor it will be to eat and drink in the kingdom of heaven. And his response is to tell the story of the banquet that the king sends out the invitation to the banquet, and remember what happens. What do all the people that get the invite say? Got better things to do. I've got a yoke of oxen. I just bought some land. I got to go make sure it's there. I have oxen, and I need to make sure they can actually pull a plow. I've got a wife, and I'm not real sure why she wasn't invited, but for whatever reason, she can't. I can't come for that. But for whatever reason, they all begin to make excuses, and the idea is that what you claim that you think is so important really isn't that important to you at all. And in fact, as you start looking into the cost of discipleship, which he says here is the great crowds are accompanying him in verse 25, in the context that's he says the idea that if anyone comes after me and will not leave his brother or mother or sister or all that he has, he cannot be my disciple. There's some things that you're going to have to put first in the kingdom. And he talks about counting the cost. And it's in this context in chapter 15 where it says the tax collectors and sinners are all drawing near and hearing them. So they're listening to this. They're excited about this for whatever reason. Obviously, they feel like they have an opportunity to be a part of this. And the Pharisees' reaction, of course, to this is what? Yeah, this man eats with tax collectors and sinners. And so that's in the context where he starts talking about the parables that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin, and ultimately the prodigal. I like to call it the lost son, because that's really what we're talking about. Three things that were lost, and in each case, we see something that was valuable to the owner or valuable to the steward for different reasons. But in all those cases, you could see somebody reacting to this and saying, "Why are you so concerned about this one and not the 10 or not the 99? You've gotten, if they're not my sheep, I wonder why are you going to go risk your own life and leave the other 99 sheep in danger to go find this one sheep? You got 99, that one sheep's not going to be that big of a deal." Well, but it is to the shepherd. And as we talked about, they may not even be his sheep, but he has a responsibility to them, whether he is the shepherd who owns them, which is most likely, or whether he's been hired to take care of them. This is his job. That one is as important as the 99, and he's going to see them as such. And you get the widow who loses the coin. As we talked about, the sheep, wanders off on his own. He doesn't know any better. He's not being rebellious. He just doesn't know what he's doing. So he just kind of I love that video where the guy finds the sheep stuck in the crevice in the concrete and he pulls him out. Sheep gets excited, starts jumping around and runs right and falls right back into it again. That's just how sheep are. And on the other hand, we've got the lost coin. Well, the coin didn't lose itself. Who lost the coin? The owner did. It's your responsibility. It's your coin. You dropped it. It didn't just get up and walk away. And now you're going to be diligent to find it. And then somebody might say, "Well, you got 9 more." Well, yeah, but it's not your coin, and you're not the one that's going to have to deal with the loss of that money. And it's important to me. There's value in this coin, and so all this is building to this idea that these things that have been lost, that Jesus is seeking after, have real value. And we get to the lost son, of course.
And now we see somebody who really shouldn't be of much value at all. This is somebody who he didn't just wander off because he didn't know what he was doing and he didn't get misplaced. He chose to leave and he did it in the most ungrateful possible way. I wish you were dead and I had your money. So divide it up now, and I'm going to go off someplace else and use it on my own. And Jesus describes this in terms to make us understand that this is just a reprehensible person. This is not somebody anybody would look at and say, that guy has value. And yet he still has value to the Father. And we see that example. And of course, this parable, we've talked about how parables, in the rule for me is that the parable has one meaning, but there's always the exception to the rule. And there's the meaning one, and then there's meaning 1A. And I think you could make an argument that the main meaning here is not about the son who was lost, but the brother who refuses to accept him back and his reaction and the idea that Jesus, as he tells him, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive, and he was lost and is found. So we're having this discussion about valuing those who are lost, those who, in your view, are beyond redemption. They're not worth following. And Jesus says, yes, they are. And it's in this context we talked about the parable of the dishonest manager in chapter 16, when he talks about the man who just it's we won't go back and redo the class, but if you go back and look at these two parables, the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the unjust steward, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities. And one of them that I really like is that Luke uses the exact same word for squandering in the parable of the loss of the unjust steward that he does in the parable of the prodigal son. They had the same problem. They didn't value what was given to them, and both of them have to reach a decision. They both come to an epiphany. The lost son says, I can't go on like this. I'm going to die. I've got to go back to my father and find a what. Maybe he'll take me back as a servant. Well, the unrighteous steward doesn't have that luxury. He doesn't have a loving father to take him back. The master doesn't care about him. The master just knows you've squandered my resources, and as a result of that, you're no longer going to be my steward. So both of them have to come up with a plan to deal with this, to ensure that they are going to be okay, that they're not going to die. And so the unrighteous steward chooses what I think we can consider an unrighteous way of dealing with this. He defrauds his master. He goes in and slashes the bills, and with the idea that if I'm nice to these people, maybe they'll be nice to me in return after I lose my job. And as we talked about last week, the master commends him for his shrewdness, not commends him for his righteousness. This is not him doing the right thing, but this is a story of two worldly people thinking about money like worldly people do. And the master looking at the steward and say, well, I got to admit, that was smart. If I were in his position, that's probably what I'd do too. And that's the idea here that Jesus makes the point. And he says, therefore, make friends for yourself of the unrighteous wealth, or in other words, as compared to the things that are righteous. He's not saying that money is inherently unrighteous, but what he's saying is, in comparison to the things that are truly righteous, use the thing God's given you on this earth to try to bring yourself into a better position to get things that are not in this earth. And again, we won't go back in. If you want to, it's online. If you want to go back and listen to some of the points we made, it's my favorite parable. There's so much things that go on it, but we won't belabor that. But all of that brings us into this, because in verse 14, if you remember, it says that the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. Meaning that, okay, they clearly understood kind of what he was saying, which is your money is not given to you to advance your status in this life. It is given to you for the purpose of using it as a righteous steward, as someone who is preparing for a greater reward and a greater responsibility. And they hear that and they say, that's ridiculous. You know, I have this money because I'm rich and because God has blessed me and I'm going to do what I want with it. And I'm certainly not going to use it to help out these people that are beneath me, that have no interest in God, that are unclean, that are unrighteous, they're in rebellion to God. And look what, look at their lives. Look at what they look like. Remember we talked about this a little bit last week. When I see a poor man groveling on the streets for money, and I'm a Pharisee, what's my first conclusion about that person? Why is he there? He did something to get there. He did something wrong. Or at the very least, he did something very foolish, whatever it was. Yeah, yeah. This big house.
Dungeon in the basement.
Yeah.
So he had the most beautiful robes. He was the most beautifully arrayed of all the priests before and after.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he's good.
Yeah, and they all did because that was a sign of importance. If I had a lot of money, that meant God was blessing me, and therefore that's another sign that if I see this person who's rich, it's like the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus and Jesus sends him away sorrowful, and the disciples are like, if he can't be saved, who can be saved? Because this is the guy that we look at and say, this is the model of what it looks like to be a good Jew. Andrew, go.
But you just said the phrase they're not going to help these people because they're not very spiritually minded. They're not very religious. Yet these are the people who are actually gathering
Yeah.
to listen to Jesus. They're actually exhibiting true
Yep.
humility and concern for righteousness and wisdom. Whereas the Pharisees, who are the ones who are really understanding what he's talking about, they're the ones rejecting the wisdom and the teaching, proving themselves really to be worse
Yeah.
than the people in the parables that Jesus is.
Exactly. And they're mocking the idea. It's almost like they're mocking the zeal that these people are even, who do you think you are that you can come and be part of this? And I think that's, as we talked about a little bit, when he talks about this idea, there's some kind of confusing passages in this section. Like in verse 16, when it says the law and the prophets were until John, since then the good news of the kingdom of God is preached and everyone forces his way into it. And that's those language that apparently even the Greek scholars aren't really sure what to do with that in some ways, and there's different ways it's being translated. We talked about a couple of ways, but I think the most likely interpretation here is that you're trying to force your way into the kingdom of heaven. You're trying to impose your views on what the kingdom ought to be, on your value system, on your brand of righteousness, and what you think is important, and you're trying to push that onto and imprint that onto this kingdom that has been brought. And that's why when you're looking at these people coming in and trying to get in, it's like they have no place in this kingdom. This is not the kind of people that ought to be in God's kingdom. And that's why I think he talks about that idea in verse 17. He connects that by saying, it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. In other words, you're making void the law because, as he gives the example in verse 16 or verse 18, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. He who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. And again, the point being, here's an example of what you do. Here's how you use the law. You've taken God's law and distorted it and taught that you can marry whoever you want whenever you want. You can divorce without cause. This is what God's law says. You're trying to make that void, as he says in other places. And there are many such traditions that you have. So, with all of that in mind, that brings us into the parable of the oh, I forgot. We got to do this. If it's well, it's working. Oh well, we'll just do it this one then. I don't know why it's not working. There we go. Now we got it. So now that brings us to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which I think in a lot of ways sums up everything that we've been talking about in this section. And I want to start, because I always do this, is start by talking about what this is not teaching. I should have brought up the graphic that somebody posted on Facebook one time. It's a pie chart that talks about the percentage of time that we spend talking about whether this is a parable or not, versus the percentage of time that we talk about how we ought to be using our wealth, which is really the point of this story. We spend about 95% of time arguing about that. I do want to at least bring that up because I think it's relatively important for us to talk about this. I used to be a lot less. I used to just say basically, I don't really care if you think it's a parable or not. I think it's important that we understand that this is in fact a parable. And the reason I do that is because what we typically do when we'll go and say, this is not a parable, this is an actual story. Why would you think that we would, what are some of the reasons you've heard that people will argue, and maybe you believe that this, and I don't want to belittle that, but if you believe this is a parable, or if people believe this is a parable, what is their argument, or what is your argument for this? What do people typically say? That it is. Why would we think this is not a parable? I'm sorry, not a parable.
So usually the first thing that people say to me is Jesus never used real names.
Yeah, never used real names.
For the parables.
Never used real names except for this one. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That's not a great argument just on its face because who knows how many parables Jesus said, and he might have used names all the time, and we just don't have them. But in this case, he does. But I do think the fact that he uses the name is significant, but maybe not for that reason. We'll talk about that in a minute. What other arguments? I think there's really two other arguments that I've heard. Yes. Yeah, why is this not a parable? Yeah.
Some people want to make an argument about how we go out and die.
Yeah. Eh,
This is an illustration what happens before the judgment, but after.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it really gets down to that. I really want this not to be a parable because we all want to know what happens after we die. We want more information. We want more details. And if this isn't a parable, if this is a real story, then now I've got a little bit of insight into that. I can see what's happening, and it almost feels like if we say, well, if this is not, if this is a parable, what you're saying is none of this is real. Uh, and I will tell you, I have no idea if Jesus is telling this as a depiction of exactly what it's like after we die, because maybe he is. Or if he's simply saying, look, this is how the Jews of that day viewed the situation. Because typically that's what they believed. They would believe that the righteous Jew who died would be brought up, that the language they would use would be brought to Abraham's bosom. That he would now be in that relationship with it. He's been gathered to Abraham and his descendants. This is how the Jews of his day would have viewed this. And it may very well be that Jesus is just describing it this way because this is what they would understand. We don't really know. And I think the main thing is that that's not really the point of this parable. It's not here to teach us about the afterlife. It goes back to one of the principles that we talked about in interpreting parables, which is we have to let Jesus determine why he's teaching this, let the context show what the message is that we need to be getting out of this. And the farther away from that we get, the more often we can get ourselves into trouble a little bit. Because again, we can find ourselves going in here and starting creating doctrine based on how Jesus says that this happens after we die. And the rich people, the good people go to Lazarus, the bad people go down to hell. And there's another thing that we might actually come out of this, because what's the only thing we know about Lazarus as opposed to the rich man? What's the one thing that we know about him as a person? Okay, he's a beggar. That's pretty much it. Now, we can make some implications or some inferences, I think. But the only thing that Jesus ever says about him is that he's poor. So maybe heaven or our eternal reward is about God giving you in the next life what you didn't have in this life. So if you were poor and you had a hard life now, God is going to reward you with a better life in the afterlife. And if you're rich and you had everything you needed, then God's going to punish you. Well, that's not the point that Jesus is making either. But it would be very easy outside of that context to maybe draw that conclusion, because the only thing I know about Lazarus from this is that he was poor and he was a beggar and he suffered. David.
Like also it teaches us we need to do the good deeds.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is actually our judgment.
Yeah.
Being judged and condemned for his act.
Yeah.
This rich man's not willing to help this poor person in this life, and he doesn't have the right hope for the act.
Yeah. Because and this is it's kind of counterintuitive, because if I've got a parable about two men and one of them is named and the other one is not, my first impulse is to say that the parable is clearly about the one that is named. This is a story about Lazarus because he's the one that gets named. But I would argue that this parable is not about Lazarus. Lazarus is there to make a point about the rich man. Larry, go ahead.
I was thinking about when Jesus talked about if you have a cup full of water to it,
Yeah.
you won't lose true anymore.
Hmm.
Well, this man here has all kinds of stuff. He can't even give help with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that reflects
Yeah.
figure represented that they're not part of the people in the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Now, there's another way. I'll get to this in a second. There's another thing I think I mentioned, the danger of making this a story and reading into it lessons. I could read this and say, well, if the rich man had just given him some crumbs, if the rich man had just helped him a little bit, everything would have been fine and we wouldn't have this problem. But again, that's not really the point. The point is to Jesus, as he so often does, is going to use hyperbole to describe the most obnoxious, extreme example that he can possibly show of this type of behavior. I have no doubt that the Pharisees of that day were not just stepping over the beggars and ignoring them and refusing to do anything. I suspect that what probably happened would they would say, "Here, my son, here is a coin for you, and God bless you," and walking away, making sure that everybody knows that he did that. I suspect that that's what's going on. So the point is not again now to David's point, you need to be doing that. The idea that I would step over this person without helping is reprehensible. But again, the parable even goes beyond that. Okay, I'm sorry, Andrew. Go ahead.
No, I would say if he's named,
Mhm.
perhaps the name has a point
Yeah.
to it, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Lazarus means the one whom God helps.
Yep, that's right.
So you said the rich are the ones who are blessed, and the poor are the ones who are cursed,
Mhm.
right? So all Jesus needs to say is he's a beggar.
Yeah.
It's going to prove his entire point.
Yeah.
Coming because he doesn't have to tell you any more about Lazarus. He's a beggar, yet he's the one whom God helps.
Yeah. Which is it better to be? Is it better to be the one that God helps or the one that I help? The one that I help myself. And I think that's right. I think there's one for sure reason that he used that name, and I think that's the for sure reason. There's another reason that I think he might use this. And we don't know that until we read the book of John. And we think about it in the context of what's been going on. Jesus is now in Jerusalem. He has made his triumphal entrance, and this parable is being given during that last week. Now, what happened just before he makes that entrance, according to the book of John? Yeah, he raises Lazarus from the dead. I don't know how much time there was between that, but it was relatively soon. In fact, we know from John's account of the triumphal entry that one of the reasons that people were going out to greet him was because they had seen the resurrection. They knew what he had done. This guy just raised this man from the dead. Now, what was the reaction of the Pharisees and the leaders to Lazarus having been raised from the dead? Let's kill him. There's a little bit of there's way too much irony and to be coincidence here. And it's skipping ahead to the end of this story because we all know how it ends. When the rich man asked if he would just send somebody from the dead, and Jesus is telling a story about a guy named Lazarus, and the implication is, hey, by the way, you want to know what happens after you die? You might go ask Lazarus. He might be able to tell you something about this. But instead, you wanted to kill him. And what that to me, there's too much to be coincidence on that, but I may be wrong, so I don't press that. But I think to your point, the meaning of that name is significant. God helps. And so we think about the contrast that is drawn in this parable. The idea that here's a man Lazarus. The language, by the way, it says that he at his gates was laid. That makes it sound like somebody just came and helped him and said the word there is to be cast down. This is somebody who basically just got thrown on the doorstep. He's just there. He's thrown, and the idea that as Jesus says, that he describes him as being covered in sore. Well, by the way, the rich man is clothed in purple and fine linen. He's clothed in sores, and it's so bad that he says that the dogs came and licked his sores. The dogs have more compassion on him than this man does. You can start to see the hyperbole being built here as he describes how bad this situation is and how arrogant this man was in terms of how he is viewing this situation. And so now you got Lazarus, who was begging for crumbs, has now been taken, and he has now been honored. In fact, the idea that he is cast down, but how does he end up? He is born up. He's cast down, he's born up. Rich man, how does he end up? He's buried. Just here's what a great contrast. Lazarus has been born up by angels to Abraham's bosom, and he died and was buried. Which one has the indignation at this point? We did the divided kingdom lesson, and I made the point that you can learn a lot about a king by how they describe how he was buried. Uh, when it just says he was buried, or he was not buried, which is even worse, as opposed to he was buried in the tombs of his father. And in some cases, like Hezekiah or Asa or Josiah, there was a lamentation, and they made a big deal about it because this is a righteous man who deserved. In fact, even Joash's mentor, Jehoiadad, the priest. It's been a while. There's a lot of Jehoias, and even he was honored and he was buried with the kings because everybody understood what he meant to the nation. This man was just buried. That's it, nothing else. And so, as we look at this and as we think about how this fits in with everything else that we've seen, And as Abraham talks to him here and responds to him, and again, I don't. This doesn't have to be a real conversation, but it is interesting that Abraham still speaks to him. You know, he doesn't speak to him unkindly. He clearly has sympathy for him, but he says, "John, you had your good things. You know, you had the good things in this life. What does that echo? You know, how many times we see Jesus' parable echo things that he has taught very clearly in other passages? When he talks about a rich man having good things in his life, you know, what does that remind you of? Well, that's true. That's true. You had a lot. You've been given a lot. And come back to that point in a second too. What else? What other languages used? Oh, last shall be first. First shall be last. That's a good one too. The one- yeah. Well, that's the one I was thinking of. Those are all good answers. That's the one I was thinking of because he talks about the idea they love to be seen. They love to do all these things for the praises of men. You've been given what you know, that's what you want, that's what you got, but you're not going to get anything else. And so the idea that you've been given all these good things, and in the contrast of in the context of what we've been talking about, the idea of someone who is a steward, what's the implication there? Here's the unrighteous steward. He was given a lot of things and he squandered it. Now, what did that prompt him to do? I better make a change. I need to start looking at this differently. Like I said last week, the unrighteous steward appears to have worked a whole lot harder in that last few days of his life than he ever did in the rest of his stewardship. Because now there was a sense of urgency. I've got to start thinking about how I can use what my master has given me to secure some sort of a future. And that's kind of the point that Abraham's making here. You had your good in this life, and the unspoken part of that is you could have done a lot of good with it. You could have used that in a godly way. You didn't have to be here. Yes, sir.
It's kind of interesting that in verse 22, it says the rich man also died on various
Hmm.
He's never called the rich man again.
Yeah.
It's just he.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I think, part of the contrast between Lazarus was not identified by his wealth.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
His name was the rich.
That's all. Yeah, that's all he was. That's a great point. He was rich. Well, he's not rich anymore. So there's really not a whole lot else that I can say about him, man. And to your point, the person that you know he's done all this. It's kind of like when Jesus talks about earlier about the man who you know he's had a great harvest. It's, what'll I do? Well, I'll build all these big barns. I'm going to tear them down, build bigger ones. I'm going to you know it's almost if I'm going to make a monument to myself. Look how successful I've been. Look how much planning I've done. And God says that's not going to be of any use to you anymore. And by the same token, the rich man is nameless. I don't know who he was. It doesn't matter who he was. He because his life was a failure. But Lazarus, who would never have been seen as successful, and the implication obviously is that here was someone who clearly had faith in God in some way. And you know, if we wanted to, again, I was trying to read too much into parables, but there's another lesson there that here's a man who depended on God, who trusted in God, and nobody would look at him and say, God is with this man. You know, God's helping him. Well, it doesn't look like it, but as it turns out, that's exactly what he was doing because he has been preserved. And so Jesus trying to get them to understand that the measure of your success in life is not about how much money you've got because it's not going to help you later on. It's how you are going to use that money, how you're going to use what you've been given. And when we think about this, going back to Lazarus, and you know, the rich man obviously has been given all kinds of things. And like I said, if all we got out of this is look, if he just all he had to do is just throw a few dollars on Lazarus' lap every once in a while, and he would have been fine. We've really kind of missed the point. That's the that's just the bare essence of humanity. Even the Pharisee would probably have heard that and say, "Yeah, that's not a really good guy. I would never do that." And I think the point probably is, yeah, but you kind of are doing that because here are these men and women who are striving to get into the kingdom. They're zealous about it. They want to come back. They want to be part of this kingdom. And your attitude is they need to stay on the doorstep where they belong. And if we choose to throw them a scrap from time to time, then that's what we'll do. And they should be happy with that. You know, that's how they saw these people. Um, but I think it is kind of interesting. You know, the rich man's been given all this. He is the unjust steward in a lot of ways. What has the Lazarus been entrusted with? What has Lazarus been entrusted with? That's all I can think of. Now, who knows? Lazarus may have been so many. I made this note, I forgot to make the point, but Lazarus could very well have been the prodigal son. I don't know if that's Jesus' intent. But, we just talked about this worthless prodigal son. Well, what if he hadn't gone back to the father? Maybe this is him. Maybe the Pharisees hearing this story and saying, yeah, that's right. Lazarus is that guy. Lazarus is the one that was ungrateful, that wasted everything. That's why he's there. His father probably wouldn't take him back. So now he's forced to beg. And that's the state in which he finds himself now. And yet, as it turns out, that doesn't appear to be his state at all. And that's an important point, David. Could have been born that way. He could be like, yeah, he might very well have been. And again, that's not necessarily the point of it, but yeah, to your point, I don't know why he's there. Yeah, yeah, exactly. He might be kind of like the blind man in John 9, who's been blind since birth. And well, what did we do with him? Well, let's take him over to the temple and let him beg because that's all he's good for. And that may very well be why he's there.
The disciples kind of help us with that understanding of the days. Who sinned? Who sinned? This man or his parents?
Yeah.
That he's this way. And then Jesus says, what kind of question is that?
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly how the Pharisees would have asked that question of Lazarus as well. Who sinned? This man or his parents? And clearly sin is not involved in the problem.
Yeah. And that's an important thing for us, I think, as a side lesson. There's always little side applications of these. One of them being that I look at my life and maybe, I don't have the life of somebody that looks like they've been particularly blessed by God. That doesn't mean God has not blessed me. And that does not mean that God has not given me something as a steward to take care of. Even if it, as you say, even if it's only my soul, that came from God. And Lazarus, who has nothing, I mean, his soul is all he's got. And maybe that's part of the point that he's trying to make intrinsically. You've got all this other stuff. This man only has God. This is all he has in his life. These people have come to realize that God is all they have. And you've taken that away from them because you've told them you're unworthy. You have done this, you're a tax collector, you're a sinner, you've done all these things, and you don't need to be in this presence anymore. But that's all they've got at this point because they've looked like Zacchaeus, who realizes that everything he has made as a tax collector is worthless. He wants to be reconciled to God, and he says, "Look, if I've wronged anybody, I will give back fourfold what I took, because those things aren't important to me." And so that's the idea that we see here, and I think that's the point that he's trying to get across, probably unsuccessfully. Other than the fact that there's two ways that we can take rebuke in Scripture. One of them being that we can take it to heart and say, I need to take warning from that, or I can get indignant and say, how dare you judge me? How dare you impugn my motives? And I'm not this guy. I'm not as bad as this guy. I could hear some people saying, "You think that that's who I am? You think that's how I act? I'm nothing like him." And Jesus says, "You're like him in everything that matters." And that's the warning. Yes, sir.
Another thing that's ironic, this rich man asked to be sent back.
Yeah.
Didn't
Yeah.
Finger in water, just cool my parched tongue.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't even thought about this, and I always wondered, did he know his name before? But somebody pointed this out while I was reading this, and I hadn't really thought about it before. That even in death, even the fact that I see myself in torment, and Lazarus is up there, Lazarus is still the guy that ought to be taking care of me. Send your errand boy down here. I don't know if that's how he meant it, but Lazarus, his role in life is to go help me, to do something for me. So send him over here to take care of me. Yes.
Well, to piggyback off that, the rich man never once asks to leave torment.
Yeah.
Lazarus can come to me and help me, or send Lazarus. Lazarus needs to lose his blessing of being in Abraham's bosom to serve me instead of give me some relief.
Yeah.
Let me come to you. Let me go to my brothers and let me tell them all this. It's always make Lazarus leave.
Yeah.
But it's never let me leave.
That's interesting. Yeah. Now that may just be because it's very clear he's not going anywhere, and maybe that's why. But your point is interesting. It's still very much centered on people doing things for me, that I'm not really the one that needs to change in any of this. And maybe that's the case. And again, it'd be very easy for us to look at this passage and think of it in terms of a man who now, faced with his own condemnation, has reached some sort of an epiphany and has grown a conscience. It really doesn't look like that's what's happening. But he at least thinks enough to say, "Can you at least send him to warn my brothers?" Now, the answer, of course, to that is what? Yeah, they got the law and the prophets. You've got enough. And the implication, by the way, was you had that too, which goes back to what Laura was pointing out earlier, and what Paul talks about in Romans 3 when he's describing, or Romans 2, excuse me, no, Romans 3, when he talks about what advantage did the Jew have. Well, they had a lot of things. They were given the prophets, they were given the law, they were given the ordinances, all the things that should have shown them how to be righteous and how to be worthy of the kingdom of God. But they wasted them. They didn't use them for the purpose they were intended. As a result of that, this is your fate. You're outside the kingdom of God, while these men that you have looked down on are now going to be blessed. And of course, Jesus makes the ironic point again, whether it's double irony with Lazarus or whether he's more specifically and clearly talking about himself when he says, "You will not believe even if someone comes and rises from the dead," which, as it turns out, well, it's generally true. There were some exceptions to that, but for the most part, and I say this, I feel like I say this all the time. Maybe this will be my catchline. I can put it on my tombstone. People believe what they want to believe, and it doesn't matter what you show them. How could Israel have rebelled against God in the wilderness with a pillar of fire leading them around, and they still went and worshipped God? Because I believe what I want to believe. At the end of the day, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'll find a way to justify it. Very good.
This account here, chronologically, did this take place?
It was after. This would have been this is in the last week, and probably one of the last days. In fact, it might have even been the day before the Passover, but it was right around in that time. So yeah, the triumphal entry is in Luke, Luke 15, 14. I can't remember which one it is. Matthew, I know. Luke, I'm not as. Yeah, it's Luke spends a lot of time in that last week. I'm sorry, 19. Oh, okay. He's got it. Well, you know what? Maybe I'm telling this wrong. Uh, I'll have to go back and remember. I may be completely wrong on that. Now, I will say that it's still very likely that he did it before Lazarus because it appears that these things are connected. He is talking to the Jews. Um, that's a great point. I'm going to have to go back and check on that and make sure I'm telling it right because I may have that wrong. Regardless, I'm good.
Like Lazarus here, talking about being raised from the dead, the parable with Lazarus,
Mhm.
who was raised from the dead.
Yeah.
If you all the purpose, chief for surname,
Yeah.
and so, there's things about coincidence.
Mhm.
I think there's a connection between the parable here and the Ben and John.
I think there probably is too.
And the reaction of, well, like you said, Lazarus was raised, they weren't full.
Yeah. It's the exact same attitude. Right, absolutely. All right. Well, we are out of time. So thank you so much for your participation. We'll take a break and we'll get started here shortly.